This video is sponsored by Incogni, more on them later. I can't seem to write perfect words, or make them flow as they should. They don't sound particularly profound. I can't paint you pretty pictures or blend colors like other artists do. My watercolors don't bleed beautifully. But I can say I love you in as many languages as you need me to. I can be fluent in loving you. So this is the first poem in Lili Reinhart's poetry collection, Swimming Lessons, and if you followed me for a long time, you probably already know that I don't like this poem. I was a little biased going into this poem because I'm honestly getting really tired of poems that are about poetry or ars poetica for the uninitiated, but what's worse is that this poem just doesn't really communicate anything in a new or interesting way. It all mostly sounds really cliché. It reminded me of Your Song by Elton John, a piece of art that arguably delivers the same message but in a much more creative way, even when setting the music aside from the lyrics. The very last line of this poem almost presents something interesting and creative, but in writing we often use the dictum show, don't tell, which is just as true for poetry as it is for prose. Don't tell me that you can be fluent in loving someone, show me what that looks like instead. That would make for a much more engaging poem. There are other isolated features that are arguably worth highlighting. For example, sound profound is an okay rhyme, and bleed beautifully has a nice ring to it. In the context of a different poem, these pieces could be doing a lot more. And I guess I won't bury the lead. Reinhardt's collection does not get much better from here, which is honestly a bummer. I went into this book with high expectations, having just finished Halsey's collection, which was actually quite good. And I know Lili Reinhart is an underrated actor. I only saw her in the first season of Riverdale, but even there I knew her talent was way above that show. Also, Lili has my same birthday, so she might as well succeed for that reason too. With all her talent, I hoped she might have a knack for poetry just as well. Unfortunately, her style mostly boils down to the shallow insta-poetry type of literature that's really popular these days, the kind of thing that I really dislike. And that's important to note, this review of Lili's work is all based on personal preference. You may be asking yourself, Jonah, roughest drafts, why even make a video on this book if you knew you wouldn't like it after the first poem? Well, I have to write this book off on my taxes somehow. Plus, Lili has a movie coming out this month, so this should be good for SEO. No, but seriously, even if I dislike Reinhardt's poetry, I still think there's something we can learn from it. What's more, even though I don't think the poems are that strong, there are some that resonated with me, which sort of prompts the question, if literature resonates, no matter its technicalities, does that automatically make it good? But before we go any further, take a look at this poem. I'm being turned inside out, forced to scrape the bottom of the barrel in order to give you more of me. But what happens when you already have everything, and you still want more? What shall I do then? And how long will it take for me to lose myself? So in this piece, Lili depicts a toxic relationship where one participant feels they have to keep giving and giving and giving, while their partner just takes and takes and takes. This poem actually reminds me of today's sponsor, Incogni. Here's the deal. Data brokers will absolutely scrape the bottom of your barrel when it comes to finding and selling your personal info. They will turn you inside out and take everything they can until you, as the poem says, lose yourself. That's exactly why you get spam calls and emails, and why you're at risk of identity theft. In the US, you're particularly vulnerable because of people search sites, where literally anyone can access information about you, from employers and landlords to stalkers and harassers. Incogni reaches out to data brokers to request your info be taken down. They handle any disputes that arise on their end. It took me less than 5 minutes to create an Incogni account, add my personal info, and watch as over 200 takedown requests went out all at once. If you follow my link, incogni.com/roughdrafts, and use the code roughdrafts at checkout, you'll get 60% off an Incogni annual plan. You'll find that link in the description and pinned comment. With Incogni conducting repeated removals, the annual plan is definitely the way to go. Once again, that's incogni.com/roughdrafts. Use code roughdrafts for 60% off the annual plan. So let's dispense with any other pretenses and jump back into the poetry. Here's the second poem in the collection. Like every other poem, it is titleless, which is admittedly a noteworthy choice. But anyhow, here it is. It's been a while since I've had a moment to miss you, and to cry. This warm summer breeze on my balcony makes me think of Cape Cod and your floral swimsuits. How you never wore sunscreen but always told us we had to. Even in this loud city, quiet moments exist where your spirit is present. And I feel like you're sitting next to me on the beach again. So I'll wait until the sun goes down before I go back inside. For now, we can sit here and listen to the ocean. Okay, admittedly, this one is a little bit better than the first, but the bar was low. There's more showing and less telling going on here. There are tangible images, experiences, and memories for us to grasp. I particularly like the detail mentioned in the third stanza. That's both unique and human. I wish the entire poem were made up of pieces like that. But despite that one piece that works, a lot of this poem just comes off as really unoriginal. I mentioned this with Halsey's poems too, but the line breaks really don't feel like they're serving much of a purpose, here or in any other poem. As with a lot of insta poetry, the line breaks feel like they're only here to make the poem look like a poem, which is super boring. But just like I said in the last video, it's hard to be intentional about line breaks, and I can sympathize with Lili there. Here's the next piece, which highlights one of the major problems with a lot of the poems in this book. "I love you, darling," were the last words you said to me. And although I don't have a recording of it, and although I forgot to save your voicemails, I will never forget the sound of your voice. I see you in every flower and every hummingbird that happens to be near. I'd like to think that it's your spirit just saying hello. You surround me, always. I miss you, and I love you too. This poem commits one of the greatest sins a poem can commit, in my opinion. It's generic. Both the language and the concept are too generic. The idea of seeing someone in the scenery around you has been done to death. If you're going to tackle that idea, you have to make it more unique than flowers and hummingbirds. What illustrates my point further is the fact that Lili just used the idea of someone's spirit being present in the last poem. A lot of the poems in the book sound like first drafts. Take this one. "This is how I know I love you so much. Whenever I see something beautiful, I want you to see it too." I've probably said this in every celebrity poetry video I've done, but it's hard for short poems to make an impact. Often when I read a poem like this, my only thought is, please give me more. When you write a poem like this that hinges on seeing beautiful things, please show me those things. What are the unique, beautiful things that only you see, and how is it that they remind you of the poem's subject? Like I said, this poem feels very much like a first draft just waiting to be filled in later. The next piece is comparatively a little more interesting throughout. "I seem to be your new favorite novel, one that keeps you up at night, turning my pages, fingers lingering on me so you don't lose your place." It's still not great, but at least Lili is experimenting with figurative language. We have an extended metaphor where the speaker refers to themselves as a novel. With that in mind, there's something here for the reader to discover. What does it mean for the subject to turn the speaker's pages? But just as before, I crave more from this. Please extend the metaphor further, dig into it until there's nothing left, then decide which pieces get to stay in the poem. This just feels way too surface level and underdeveloped. Also, I feel like I've seen the word linger in a million poems. Get it out of there. This poem is similar. "My Delilah. I remember her on our porch, how she closed her eyes in the sun as I held her close to me. I can hear the wind chimes from a summer afternoon. I was always clinging to her, trying to savor our quiet moments. She knew I loved her, without ever learning my words, and she loved me right back." So again, there is something for the reader to consider and discover here. Who is Delilah? What was their relationship like with the speaker? And ultimately, what effect did Delilah have on the speaker that moved them to say these words? That said, it's still far too underdeveloped. For those of you who know about Lili Reinhart, maybe you know exactly who Delilah is. So when I ask who she is, don't answer me. I should be able to glean that information from the poem itself. I don't have to have Delilah's biography here, but I need to know why the speaker is telling us all of this, and ultimately why the poet decided to write that poem. What is it that's so unique about the speaker's relationship with Delilah that it demands this poem? If the answer is love, what separates the speaker's love for Delilah from every other love poem out there? Okay, I think I made my point there. Take a look at this one next. "The memories these walls keep, I wish they could speak, so I could relive you touching me." Okay, on top of all the problems previously mentioned, this poem frustrates me because I feel like Lili is much closer to getting it with this one. I think the concept isn't that bad. The idea of speaking to walls and asking them about everything they've seen. That could make for a unique, even a silly poem. But Lili needs to go deeper. As it stands, the bridge between stanzas 2 and 3 isn't even quite there. Show us how the walls speaking could make you relive a memory. How is that different from you just remembering or trying to retell it yourself? A far more interesting poem would stem from an actual written conversation with the walls. Also nitpicking here, but as it's written, they in the second stanza refers to memories in the first stanza, not these walls. And hell, maybe that's what Lili meant, but somehow I doubt it. Here's another one that I think comes close. You pointed out the Big Dipper to me on the balcony near the end of summer, but I'll let myself forget so you can show me again. Just tell me more about the stars, my love. Allow me to lose myself in your constellations. With this one, I like the idea of pretending you don't remember something so you can hear it again. That's undeniably pretty cute. But please, build on that idea. It's like in stand-up comedy. An observation alone isn't enough to make a joke. There has to be an expansion on the observation, usually a hyperbole of some sort to reveal the humor in the observation. Poetry is similar. It can't just be one observation or one event. You have to expound to truly reveal something about humanity. Speaking of observations, take a look at this poem. A single flame can light up a room. That was you, my love. But it can burn. Also you. I audibly sighed when I read this one for the first time. There's nothing unique or clever about these observations. The phrase light up a room is a total cliche, as is the idea that fire burns us. In fact, it's kind of hard to write about fire in a way that's not cliche. It's an utterly timeless idea, of flames burning. If anything, this poem shows that you have to dig deeper with the more common concepts. If you're going to use fire in your poem, what will make your fire stand out from all other literary fires? Next up, we've got this piece. You let me lay on your clean sheets and wrap myself in your damp duvet. The tumbling washing machine mixed with the sound of your video games. My only thought when I first read this was, what? At first I thought the implication was that the speaker had been put in the washing machine with the bedsheets and duvet. Eventually I realized that was probably not the case, and that the speaker was merely trying to paint a scene with themselves in bed and the accompanying sounds around them. That's not a bad premise. We talk a lot about using imagery in poetry, and sounds are a huge component in imagery. In fact, we often rely way too much on visuals and not enough on the other senses. But again, if the intention was to focus on sounds, Lili needs to go deeper. Two sounds is not doing it for me. And I have to ask, was I the only one confused when reading this? Am I a moron? I mean, yes, I am, but specifically when it comes to this poem. Let me know. I have to highlight this one too. It seems to be our winter, so I'll try to make snow angels in your cigarette smoke. This one made me laugh, because in the Halsey video, they had a poem about how cliché smoke is as a motif. I don't think I'll ever be able to read a poem that includes smoke again without laughing, no matter the poem's quality. But this one is rather lamentable because the idea of making snow angels in smoke is kind of neat, but again, there has to be more than just one decent visual. What does it actually say about the human condition? Expound, please. Here's another with a decent concept but a fumbled execution. My heart feels heavy today, but not because of sorrow. It feels full, or swollen. It's like I've discovered a new compartment inside myself, with all this room left to fill. And I'm filling it, easily, with you. I feel you latching onto a piece of myself that will only continue to grow as I grow. You are engraved in me, settling comfortably into my empty spaces. The structure here again feels really pretentious, where we have all these lines that make up their own entire stanzas, when those words really just do not carry that much weight. Plus, a lot of these words are kind of standard poetry fare, like latching and engraved. I'll acknowledge that I read too much poetry, but those words just come off as a bit overused to me. With all of that said, I do like the idea of taking the phrase heavy heart and turning it on its head, making it more joyous than sad. That's where a lot of good poetry comes from, turning colloquialisms around like that. But like I said, the execution is fumbled. In one moment the speaker says their heart feels full, and in the next moment they say there is room left to fill. Which is it? I could say more, but I think I'd be beating a dead horse. In fact, I could go on about several other poems in this book, but I don't think I have anything more to say about these pieces that hasn't already been said. I will note there are poems even shorter than these in the collection, and as you can imagine, they do not justify their brevity. Let's take a look at a few of the longer pieces, which certainly aren't perfect, but generally are better than probably all of these shorter ones. We'll start with this one. There are moments where I remember that I only have this one life. Maybe you believe in reincarnation, but even if that happens, you come back as an entirely different being, in an entirely different life. You wouldn't even remember the mistakes you've made as someone else, so how could you learn from them? A sensation that feels like the opposite of déjà vu. It's not that you've been there before, but that you're only going to be there once. You become acutely aware of how little time you have. Each day or month that passes can feel like it has little significance. Until it's 5 years later, and the realization hits that you were waiting for a chance to learn from your mistakes, and you ignored it. You missed it, and you absolutely will not get it back, at least not in this life. If we could experience those kinds of moments each day, where we remember for even 1 second how little time we have, would we live differently? I would drink more, indulge in wild, blurred nights, stay awake to watch the sunrise, and learn the constellations by heart. I'd sing loudly, without the consideration of my neighbors. I'd fly home on a weekend, even if there were no non-stop flights. Take beautiful pictures with the camera I bought, but hardly ever use. Tell my dad that in elementary school, I used to say my favorite color was yellow, because that's what his was. And I wanted to be just like him. I know we wouldn't wait around as much. No waiting for signs to point us in the right direction, only following our gut. I wish I could live this way now, because my biggest fear is waking up in another 5 years and realizing that I've wasted so much of what little time I have left. Okay, this one is worth highlighting because at the very least, Lili is attempting some more showing than telling. Is she showing very effectively? Not really, but she's trying. Like, for example, when highlighting the ways in which the speaker would live differently. At least she's trying to do some showing there. Or the little anecdote about how the speaker adopted their father's favorite color. I kind of like that tidbit. But otherwise, there is just way too much telling going on here. The poem honestly feels a little rambly and meandering, and not in the good way. Also, these lines where she says, "I'd fly home on a weekend even if there were no nonstop flights." Is it just me, or do those lines kind of reveal her privilege? I don't know, maybe I'm misinterpreting. Next up. This is how I can explain it to someone who can't fully understand. I speak with my hands. They're the most enthusiastic part of myself. And I use my body as a map. This is me. I hold up my right hand horizontally as a vocal coach does when explaining the rising pitches of do, re, mi, fa, and so on. My hand is at the level of my shoulders. This is me on the day to day. Going through the motions, mostly steady, complacent, low energy. This is you, I say. I lift my left hand up to my chin. This is you every day. Generally happy, you don't think of each day as getting by. You're positive, content. Sometimes we are equal. A good day can make us both feel like this. I raise both of my hands to the top of my head, one on either side of my temple. Each hand represents two different people, achieving the same state of being. Elated, high, full of energy, laughing so hard it hurts your stomach. Of course, I am able to feel these things. It's harder to achieve, but I can get there. It's just that I'll have a greater fall back down to reality. To go from here, hands at the top of my head, to here, hands at my shoulders. Going from this elation, this joyfulness and ecstasy, to this average, mundane state can even bring us lower. I bring my right hand to my chest. I refer to this placement as rock bottom. You can reach the same lows as me, of course, just as I can reach your highs. I bring both hands to my chest. It's no contest. Certainly not one that anyone can win. We are just here. Some of us living slightly above or slightly below others. So this one loses a lot of its momentum as it goes on, but I like the framing of it, how the poem is built around the speaker's hand motions. There's even a decent simile toward the beginning there as the speaker describes their hand motions as that of a vocal coach. That's kind of neat. But ultimately, what the speaker is describing doesn't amount to much, and it just kind of drags, honestly. Still, Lili was trying to do something different here, and I applaud her for that. Then we've got this piece, which isn't as long comparatively, but is distinct from a lot of the other poems in the book. My head feels claustrophobic, resting in this sink. My ears are ringing inside this blue ceramic bowl, slowly waiting for the water to sink into my pores and drown out these flashes of color behind my eyes. Focus, for a moment. Then a droning pulse of vibration every other second, the faint feeling of spinning like an optical illusion that never stops. Parts of my body turning in opposite directions, like a merry-go-round. Just breathe. Remember to blink. Flex the corners of your mouth up. Lift your chin, not too high. Don't let them see your empty eyes. Much like the last poem, this one starts off pretty well, but ultimately loses a lot of momentum. Still, I have to give Lili credit. Those opening stanzas are decently engaging. In the Halsey video, we talked about starting poems on the most interesting note and then keeping them interesting all throughout. I honestly think the first 2 lines of this poem are a pretty good hook. Immediately, Lili plants seeds of curiosity for the reader. Why is the speaker's head in the sink? Why are their ears ringing? What exactly is going on here? Ultimately, I don't think the poem remains very interesting throughout, failing to deliver on its unique premise, but there was an attempt here. This next poem sort of gave me a realization about the book overall. Take a look. We waste so much time waiting for things to get better. We pay little attention to the hours winding down, the hours we'll want more of in the end, hours that we wish we hadn't taken for granted. The idea of complacency has always terrified me. I've always been impatient. In middle school, I wanted more friends. I wanted to be better liked and by more people. I wanted to be less anxious and more social. I wanted to be like my best friend. You could pick her face out of a crowd. She always seemed to be shining. I wanted to move away. I wanted to be on my own. Looking back, it seems like I spent the entirety of my teenage years in waiting. There was always something more that I wanted, and it was always out of reach. I felt out of control in my own life. My anxiety steered me in whatever direction it wanted, regardless of how miserable I was and how often I prayed for it to get better. But it did eventually, when I took my life into my own hands and steered it towards my future. Not to say I didn't crash land at times, but that only pushed me to fight harder and never settle for anything less than what I wanted. I'll be honest, I don't think this poem is particularly good, but after I read it, the only thing I could think was how heavily this poem would probably resonate with a teenage audience. In fact, I started to wonder, why wasn't this just written for and marketed toward teenagers? A lot of the poems just come off as life and relationship advice for a younger audience. And that's not to say that teenagers can't appreciate more refined or traditional poetry, but much like Rupi Kaur, this is the sort of gateway poetry that could set younger audiences on a path toward better stuff. It would have been easy to remove the curse words in some of the more risque pieces, but I imagine this book intended to cast a wide net, and ultimately I think that actually kind of hurts it. If this book were intended for a younger audience, I wouldn't necessarily excuse the worst parts of it, but I would understand the more simplified construction behind a lot of these poems. But alas, here we are. I also mentioned up at the top of this video that there were a few poems that resonated with me. I counted 8 poems that reminded me of my experiences with relationships. We'll take a look at just a few of these and decide whether their resonance counts for something. You say that this love feels different now. How could it not? You've broken me, and I'll never be put together the same way. As much as this poem might remind me of myself or past relationship experiences, it's just utterly cliché. Much like the fire symbol, how many times have we seen this sort of thing in literature and poetry? The idea of being broken or put back together or trying to pick up the pieces. This next one isn't that bad compared to the other pieces in the book, but again, I might just feel that way because it slightly resonates with me. I keep reminding myself that we are not feeling the same things. You said so yourself. I'm more invested than you are. You're not experiencing this rejection. Sitting with one leg crossed over the other, smoking cigarettes and turning from me as you exhale, shifting your attention away. I'm sitting miles from you, it seems, memorizing the curl of smoke escaping your lips, feeling the loss of you, the strain in my chest when you forget I'm even here. And that's what hurts the most, feeling this alone. Mutual heartbreak would be the only comforting option, but you can't seem to spare me that. First of all, haha, smoke again, but at least that gives us something to latch on to. I honestly don't think Lili is using the cliché to the fullest, but still, at least we have some measure of showing rather than telling. Again, I acknowledge that I might be showing some extra love to this poem because it partially resonates with me, but I also have to highlight the last stanza. It's kind of funny, but also sad, and it actually feels like a logical conclusion to the poem. Don't get me wrong, this still doesn't feel like a completed draft, but at least there's something to it. Alright, here's the last poem we'll take a look at. Coming in at a whopping 6 pages, this is the longest piece in the book. That said, I think it was also the piece I liked more than any other in the book. This deep and droning pulse to love him wasn't a choice, it was a need that led me to pursue this beautiful but broken person, this emotionally unavailable human being whose heart was so wrapped up in fear of being vulnerable and exposed, fear of feeding the ache that was already growing, that I craved passionate, overwhelming euphoria. I wanted that kind of love so desperately that I was willing to hurt myself in order to find it. I wanted to love him, and so I did. Through the rejection and the women, I was there, feeling weak. I kept offering my heart to someone who didn't want it, humiliating myself within the pages of a journal that I filled with thoughts of him. But it was love, overflowing, and that's what kept me coming back. The faith that I had placed in the words, "Your heart will never lead you astray." So I kept loving and I let myself fall. I welcomed the inevitable heartbreak. I accepted the reality that I was a hopeless romantic. And when I told him I loved him, it was because I couldn't hold it in any longer. There had been so many moments lying next to one another, with my head on his chest, my eyes stinging with tears. I desperately wanted to say, "I love you," but I was scared that it would push him away, until the overwhelming urge became too heavy to keep in. That rainy, gray afternoon, I walked unshielded under the clouds. I held his face in my hands and said those words. Words that felt as if they were crafted for that moment. And it didn't matter if I was rejected, it was pure truth, whether it was reciprocated or not. I cried when I first heard him say those words back to me, like a confession, something that he hadn't quite accepted yet, something he was afraid to say out loud because then it would become real, and he could never take it back. You can't deny your heart. It won't be ignored, and it will kick you in the ass until you accept it. Through all of my tears and anxieties, my fear of never receiving his love, we came together, and I believe I was meant to love him, to give love to someone who so desperately needed it, and yet pushed it away fervently. I didn't step back, I latched on even harder, and broke through the walls, and thank God I did. How lucky I am to love someone so much, and to know I can give so much to one person. A man who deserves to be told, "I love you," as many times a day as it crosses my mind. First, let me acknowledge my bias here. I think I liked this one so much purely because it resonated with me and reminded me of past experiences. But is it a good poem? Honestly, I don't think so. There's honestly nothing all that poetic about it. It reads just like prose. The only thing that really makes it a poem are the line breaks and the fact that Lili calls it a poem, which is technically enough, but still, come on. I will say the ending is surprisingly bittersweet and took a direction I wasn't expecting. It's always good when an author can surprise me. What's more, I honestly think Lili conveys things better when she has more words to work with. That's not to say all the longer poems are slam dunks, they are not, but they are generally more effective than her shorter poems. Alright, let's do some overall thoughts and reflections. First, I do want to highlight the illustrations. These were done by Kurt Montgomery. I really don't love them, but to each their own. They slot in pretty nicely with the whole insta poetry style. As far as other aesthetic pieces go, Lili often does that same thing that Megan Fox's book did, where poems generally only appear on the right-hand pages, and the left-hand pages are blank, have a drawing, or are entirely red. Aesthetically, I don't hate these red pages, but this really isn't what I look for in a poetry book, and it often does just feel like a waste of paper. Some of Lili's favorite motifs include water, as in the beach, ocean, tears, or just the general idea of water. Since the book is called Swimming Lessons, that's not too surprising. There's also the general idea of color, like usually not very specific colors, but just the word color, which feels kind of weird. Another common theme is the idea of living in the moment. Like, seriously, if the poems aren't about love or relationships, there's probably a 90% chance they're about living in the moment. I'm sure I've said this before, but in poetry, how you say something is far more important than what you have to say. For example, love poems. We will never stop writing love poems, but since there are millions of love poems out there already, what is it that differentiates yours? It's all about how you say it. So if Lili wanted, every single poem in this book could have been about living in the moment, as long as she made each poem distinct and creative. But as is, so many of the poems in this book just feel way too samey. Granted, that sort of thing can happen with even some of the best poets out there. Everyone generally has their particular style, don't they? I recently read Weaving Sundown in a Scarlet Light by Joy Harjo, and I'll admit some of these poems did feel quite similar to each other. But the difference between Harjo's collection and Reinhardt's is the impression I had when I closed each book. When I finished Harjo's collection, I had so many feelings buzzing around inside me, so many things to consider. Out of the 50 poems in the book, I could specifically remember at least 3 off the top of my head that made a huge impression on me. But when I closed Lili's book, I didn't really feel anything, despite all the poems that reminded me of myself and my experiences. And once I had finished the collection, genuinely none of the poems really stuck out in my memory. That was, in part, because they all felt really samey. But more than just feeling similar to each other, a lot of Lily's poems sounded like poems I'd read before. I won't keep harping on about it, but as I've said throughout this video, there just wasn't anything all that unique to latch onto with any of these pieces. Even with Megan Fox's collection, I still remember some of her religious-based poems. Even though the execution wasn't on point, there was still something to set those pieces apart. Before we wrap up here, I want to read from Lily's introduction, then from the notes section of Harjo's collection. In Lily's introduction, she writes, "I believe that we read poetry to relate to the world. We see our lives through the words of a poet when we are incapable of expressing ourselves. I started reading poetry as a way to comfort myself through spells of depression. Discovering poems that closely reflected the thoughts in my own head became reassuring in a time when I felt severely misunderstood. It's hard to imagine that anyone out there could possibly feel the same things that you do, to the depths that you feel them. Therein lies the beauty and surprise of poetry. Once you see that someone understands your feelings, suddenly you're not alone anymore. I decided a little over a year ago that I wanted to share my own collection of poems in the hopes that they could bring comfort to whomever is looking for it. The inspiration for this collection came from personal experiences as well as experiences that are not my own. Emotion can be explored and felt through the fabrication of a story, and some of these poems were crafted out of pure empathy for those around me. Each one of us leads vastly different lives, and yet we can all relate to the fundamental feelings of happiness and sorrow. I hope that you, the reader, can see yourself reflected in my words." Now, on its face, I don't really have a problem with anything in this introduction. I agree with Lily, poetry is all about connection and empathy. If you felt connected to Lily via the poems I read in this video, that's great. I don't want to take that away from you. If you like her poems, more power to you. But now, let's read a bit from Harjo. Here, she's commenting on one of her poems titled, "For Calling the Spirit Back from Wandering the Earth in Its Human Feet." We get lost sometimes, or lose parts of ourselves in our story making. Words got us there. Words can assist in calling us back. A colleague years back in one of my first academic jobs made a point to tell me, after striding into my office and perching without permission on my desk, that there are two kinds of poets. Jacob poets are refined, he reminded me, like Jacob in the Bible. "Are you familiar with the Bible?" he asked. "You," he pointed out, "are an Esau poet." Esau was Jacob's brother who lived far out in the wilderness of the desert. He lacked refinement. He lived like the animals in the wild. If this colleague's behavior is indicative of civilization, I don't want it. The so-called civilized might argue that poetry is only poetry when it showcases an ability to make complicated metrical literary constructions in classical verse forms. The act of writing poetry then becomes a purely mental technical game only a few and only the most highly educated are capable of playing. In retrospect, after nearly 40 years, I should have responded that I would rather live in the wild with the animals. Poetry is found there. It is, without pretense, closer to the singing roots of language. Ultimately, there is no hierarchy. All poetry has roots in orality. Those who perfect the use of language, whether it be in poetry, lyrics, storytelling, or other forms of oratory, know intimately that words can create and destroy. The better and tighter the craft and care, the finer the trajectory. I don't recall what I said in that moment, or if I said anything at all. This experience was to be repeated in various versions along the way. My relationship with poetry remains complicated, contradictory, and mysterious. Poetry is as demanding of me as I am of poetry. Now, I love this anecdote and Harjo's reflections for so many reasons. For one thing, she's absolutely right. Poetry shouldn't be gatekept, and honestly, I'm guilty of doing that sometimes, whether I mean to or not. But poetry doesn't have to be a complicated construction in classical verse. Poetry shouldn't be something in which only the privileged or educated get to participate. But at the same time, poetry requires that we perfect the use of language, as Harjo says. Poetry is demanding. It demands as much from us as we demand from it. And I'm sorry if this sounds mean, but it just doesn't seem like Reinhart's poetry demanded all that much from her. And ultimately, I don't think it'll stand out much in my memory going forward. But what do you think? How did you like Lily's poetry? Do you agree or disagree with me here? Please tell me everything. And hey, before you go, take a look at this poem. This is a piece called Drenched in Despair by one of my patrons, Zhang Jie. Drenched in despair. I stay in for melancholy, 'cause it's all vain outside. For you may feel eternal hope springs, for it's pouring down eternally. For the chance to see one of your poems at the end of a video, or if you just like what I do here and want to support, you can donate to my Patreon too. You'll get to see videos early, gain access to the community Discord, and have priority review for your work over on the second channel. You're seeing the names of my patrons scrolling on screen right now, and I seriously can't thank them enough. I also want to thank Incogni again for sponsoring this video, and remember to use my link incogni.com/roughdrafts for 60% off an annual plan. If you want to support me in other ways, you can do all the things the algorithm likes, and you can follow me on my socials. That's all for now, and keep in mind, ultimately, this is a rough draft.